The wind carried the scent of damp earth as the gates of the Hollow Ridge Animal Sanctuary creaked open, groaning like a memory long buried. The sky above was a flat gray, heavy with unshed rain, casting a dull light over the chain-link fences and muddy paths. At the center of it all, a boy in a wheelchair sat still, unmoving, as if carved from stone. His name was Ethan Wallace, and he hadn't spoken a word to anyone outside his home in nearly 5 months. Next to him walked Seraphine Dreadmore, his occupational therapist. She wore the green uniform shirt of the sanctuary, her long dark braid damp with mist. Calm and composed on the outside, her eyes betrayed the weight of this moment. She had worked with Ethan for nearly a year, through the silence, the tears, the walls he built around himself after the accident that had taken his ability to walk and his father. Further along the fence, 4 women paused their conversation when they noticed the boy. Among them stood Rowena Blackmore, the shelter's lead caretaker. She watched Ethan closely. He kept his gaze low, uninterested in the barking dogs flinging themselves against their cages, desperate for attention. Nothing moved him, not until they reached the far end of the yard, where the forgotten animals were kept. A large golden retriever, with eyes like worn amber and fur matted at the ends, lay quietly in the corner of his pen. He did not bark. He did not move. He simply looked at Ethan, a long, steady gaze that pierced through the noise and chaos around them. Rowena spoke softly. "That's Havoc. He's been returned 3 times. Too quiet, too strange. People say there's something off about him." Without asking, Seraphine opened the gate. Havoc stood slowly, his gaze never leaving the boy. He approached with solemn grace, stepping through the mud until he reached Ethan. Then, gently, he pressed his head against the boy's knee. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then Ethan, silent, broken Ethan, lifted his hand and rested it on the dog's head. "He understands," Ethan whispered. The silence that followed was louder than any bark. Seraphine's breath caught in her throat. Rowena stared, wide-eyed. Havoc sat beside Ethan's wheelchair, still and certain, as if he had always belonged there. But this was only the beginning. Havoc carried more than silence in his eyes, and the truth he held would soon turn Ethan's world upside down. Back in the van, the ride home was quiet but different. Not the oppressive silence that had haunted Ethan for months, but something softer, almost thoughtful. Havoc lay on the floor beside his wheelchair, his head resting against the boy's shoe as if anchoring him to something real. Seraphine Dreadmore sat in the front seat, pretending not to glance into the rearview mirror every few seconds. She didn't want to break the moment. Ethan's whispered words still echoed in her mind. He understands. When they reached the Wallace home, a quiet, ivy-wrapped house near the woods, Ethan didn't wait to be helped out of the van. For the first time in ages, he moved with quiet intent. Karen Wallace, his mother, stood at the porch with a mug of coffee pressed between her palms, confusion crossing her face when she saw the dog. "Is he staying?" she asked. Seraphine hesitated, but Ethan answered without looking up. "Just for the weekend." It was only 5 words, but Karen nearly dropped her mug. That night, Ethan didn't close the door to his room. Havoc slept at the foot of his bed, breathing slow and deep like a distant lullaby. Ethan stayed awake for hours, his fingers brushing against Havoc's fur as his thoughts circled things he hadn't allowed himself to feel. The crash, his father's voice, the metal bending around him. But somehow, the weight of those memories felt a little less crushing with Havoc near, as if the dog had seen darkness too, and survived it. The next day, Seraphine returned with Emily Monroe, her younger sister and a local veterinarian. Emily had long auburn hair tied up with a pencil, and a clipboard filled with handwritten notes. She knelt beside Havoc, checking his eyes, joints, and heart rate with careful precision. "He's older than he looks," she murmured. "Scar tissue on his right flank, and this." She lifted Havoc's collar to reveal a small tattoo, nearly faded numbers. A code, not standard for a pet, more like something military. Ethan leaned forward. "What does it mean?" he asked, voice hoarse but curious. Seraphine and Emily exchanged a glance. "We don't know," Emily admitted, "but I can try to trace it." Ethan nodded once, but his eyes stayed locked on the numbers burned into Havoc's skin. That night, he dreamed for the first time in months of snow, fire, and a man in uniform whispering, "Stay with him." In the shadows of that quiet town, secrets were beginning to stir, and somewhere buried in Havoc's past, a truth waited to be uncovered. For the next 3 days, Ethan barely left Havoc's side. The dog followed him through every room, responding not to commands but to presence. As though the two shared an unspoken language built from pain and silent endurance. Karen watched the growing bond with cautious hope, unsure if this was a fleeting connection or something deeper. Each time she passed Ethan's open door and saw Havoc curled beside the wheelchair, something stirred in her. Something she hadn't felt since before the accident. Possibility. Meanwhile, Emily worked tirelessly to trace the numbers inked on Havoc's skin. She contacted shelters, military databases, and old colleagues from her time at the Cold Grave Veterinary Institute. The tattoo was faded, but legible enough. N67321A. Not a common registration. Not even civilian. One late night, while sipping cold tea at her desk, she finally found a lead. A restricted archive from a now-defunct K-9 military program flagged the code. The file was labeled Valkyrie Flint Rose, Unit Retired/Classified Loss. Emily's stomach tightened. Valkyrie Flint Rose wasn't a handler. It was a project name. She printed the document, but most of it was redacted. The only detail still visible was a year, 2016, and a list of names connected to the project. Among them, Tom Reed, a former military handler who'd been listed as medically discharged after incident. She jotted down his last known address, just 2 counties away. The next day, Seraphine drove Ethan and Havoc into town under the pretense of getting fresh air. As they passed the rusted sign for Gravenhart Park, Seraphine spoke carefully. "There's someone I want you to meet." Ethan said nothing, but Havoc raised his head. His ears perked up, body tense. By the time they reached the small wooden house on the edge of the trees, Havoc was standing. Not barking, alert. Ready. Tom Reed opened the door with a limp in his right leg and eyes that had seen too much. At first, he didn't react. But when Havoc stepped forward into the porch light, Tom froze. His mouth opened slightly. "You," he whispered. Then louder, "You're alive." Havoc took one step closer. Tom knelt, ignoring the pain in his knee, and pressed his forehead to the dog's. "We buried you. They told me you were gone." Ethan watched, stunned. Something cold and electric passed through him, a connection to a life he didn't know Havoc had lived. Tom looked up, his voice shaking. "Kid, this dog saved 12 lives in Syria. They left him behind." Valkyrie Flint Rose wasn't just a program. It was a cover-up. And just like that, Ethan's companion became something more than a rescue. He was part of a truth no one wanted uncovered. Ethan sat on the worn couch in Tom Reed's living room, his hands resting on Havoc's back, feeling the slow rhythm of the dog's breath. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and old books, and every wall was covered in faded photographs. Soldiers, mountains, desert sunsets. Tom moved slowly as he limped toward the fireplace, retrieving a metal box. His fingers trembled as he unlocked it, revealing folded documents, medals, and a torn photograph of Havoc, younger and stronger, beside a group of men in uniform. He was more than just a soldier, Tom began, voice low. He was trained to detect emotional shifts, fear, trauma, even intent. We called it empathic conditioning. Most of the handlers didn't believe it worked until they saw what he could do. "We thought we'd lost him in an airstrike near Ashbourne Ridge. That was the last mission before everything went dark." He paused, looking at Ethan. "They shut the whole project down, burned the records. Anyone who asked questions was silenced." Seraphine, seated quietly in the corner, leaned forward. "Why would they do that? Why hide something like this?" Tom shook his head. "Because Havoc didn't fail. He succeeded too well. But they feared what it meant. If a dog could emotionally sync with humans, predict danger not by scent but by instinct, it terrified them. He was proof of something they didn't want to explain." Ethan's mind raced. That quiet, broken dog had already done something impossible. He'd reached him. He'd felt Ethan's pain the moment they locked eyes. Emily joined them later that evening, holding the printed files she'd uncovered. She spread them across the table like puzzle pieces. Valkyrie Flint Rose wasn't the name of a program, she corrected. It was the code name for Havoc himself. They gave him a military identity. That's why his tattoo doesn't match any civilian registry. She pointed to a redacted section. But here's where it gets worse. There's mention of a failed extraction, a child involved. The date matches the year Ethan's father died. The room went still. Ethan looked up slowly. My dad was military intelligence, he said. Karen had mentioned it only once, long ago. He traveled a lot, mostly overseas. Tom's expression darkened. Then this wasn't a coincidence, he muttered. Havoc finding you? It wasn't luck. It was memory. Recognition. Ethan stared at the dog beside him, suddenly unsure whether Havoc had truly been rescued or had come looking for him. And in that moment, the line between past and present, between man and animal, began to blur. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Havoc lay beside his bed, his breathing calm, but something had shifted between them. The knowledge that this dog had once belonged to a classified military unit, that he might have known his father in some distant, scorched place across the world. It was too much to carry. Ethan stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, images flashing in his mind that he didn't know were his, or Havoc's. A flicker of memory. Smoke, shouting, the sound of boots on gravel, and then a deep, pained growl. In the early morning, just before sunrise, Ethan wheeled himself onto the back porch. The air was cold, the kind that bites but also clears the mind. Havoc followed, sitting beside him without command. The boy looked down. You were there, weren't you? When it happened. Havoc tilted his head, and for the first time, Ethan saw something ancient behind the dog's eyes, grief. Recognition. As if the animal carried not just memory, but guilt. Karen stepped outside moments later, robe wrapped tightly around her. She watched her son and the dog for a long moment. Your father? He wasn't supposed to take you on that trip, she said quietly. He disobeyed orders. Said he needed to show you what he did. Let you see the real him. Her voice broke. When the accident happened, I thought it was just bad luck. But now, with everything we've learned. She didn't finish the sentence. Ethan didn't need her to. Later that day, Emily returned to the house with new information. I got access to a redacted report. There was a failed exfiltration in Syria. 2 operatives and a child were caught in crossfire. Only the child survived. She looked at Ethan. That child's name was never recorded. But what if it was you? Ethan shook his head. That doesn't make sense. The accident was here. In the U.S. Emily nodded. Exactly. So why did that report list a location just outside Hollowridge? Tom Reed called not long after. I think I found something. A private storage unit registered under your dad's military alias, Flint Rose. It hasn't been opened in years. Ethan's chest tightened. Flint Rose. That name again. It wasn't just Havoc's code name. It had belonged to his father too. By the time they arrived at the unit, dusk had already begun to fall. The key fit perfectly. Inside, dust danced in the narrow light streaming through cracks in the walls. Old boxes, a metal trunk, and one worn leather journal sat waiting. On the first page, in faded ink, were the words, "If you're reading this, it means the truth has found its way back." Ethan turned the brittle page with care, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The handwriting was strong but hurried, unmistakably his father's. Karen stood behind him, breath shallow, her hand resting gently on the back of his wheelchair. Seraphine, Emily, and Tom remained silent, their eyes fixed on the pages as Ethan began to read aloud. They warned me never to bring Valkyrie home. They said he wasn't safe outside protocol. But I knew the truth. He wasn't a weapon. He was the only one who remembered what they tried to bury. Each entry painted a picture more disturbing than the last. Ethan's father, operating under the name Valkyrie Flint Rose, had been part of an unsanctioned intelligence mission meant to uncover war crimes committed by their own government allies. Havoc, or rather, the K-9 unit known as Valkyrie, had imprinted emotionally on the victims. reacting violently when exposed to certain personnel. That behavior made him a threat, not an asset. They ordered him decommissioned. Instead, Ethan's father had taken him and disappeared. One entry stood out. "I'm bringing Ethan with me. They'll say it's irresponsible, but I can't hide the truth from my own son. He needs to know what we stood for, what we lost." Karen gasped when she read those words, tears welling in her eyes. "He never told me," she whispered. "He never said why he took Ethan on that trip." Tom, jaw tight, responded, "Because he knew they were coming. And if something happened to him, Havoc would remember." Ethan flipped to the final page. It was dated just 3 days before the crash. The tone had shifted, urgent, paranoid. "If they find us, they'll erase us. If anything happens to me, Valkyrie will find Ethan. He always knew how to find him. Protect the boy. Trust the dog." Ethan sat back, shaken. It hadn't been chance that brought Havoc into his life. It had been loyalty, memory, purpose. Later that evening, while the adults spoke in hushed tones in the kitchen, Ethan sat alone with Havoc in the living room. He ran his fingers along the dog's neck, just above the faded tattoo. "You didn't forget," he said softly. "You came back for me." Havoc rested his head on Ethan's lap and closed his eyes. That small gesture, quiet, deliberate, meant more than words ever could. But as the truth settled over them, another reality began to form. If someone had tried to silence Ethan's father all those years ago, they might not be done yet. And now that Havoc had resurfaced, now that Ethan was digging into the past, someone, somewhere, could be watching. The house was quiet that night, but something about the silence felt wrong. Ethan stirred in bed, Havoc at his feet as always, his ears twitching in restless patterns. A faint metallic click echoed from somewhere outside, subtle, distant, too soft for human ears, but Havoc's head shot up instantly. He growled low, a sound Ethan had never heard from him before. Then, without warning, the dog stood and walked to the window, his body rigid, his tail still. Ethan followed the movement with growing unease. "What is it?" he whispered, wheeling himself closer. Havoc didn't bark. He just stared into the dark woods beyond the yard, his stance protective. Ethan squinted but saw nothing, only trees swaying in the wind, shadows shifting like ghosts. Still, something cold crawled down his spine. He reached for his phone to call Seraphine, but the signal was dead. No bars, no connection, just static silence. In the morning, Karen noticed it too. Scratches on the side of the garage door. Fresh footprints in the mud. Someone had been there. Emily inspected the area with quiet dread. "These aren't animal tracks," she murmured. "Too clean. Too deliberate." Tom arrived later, tense, carrying an old duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were maps, surveillance equipment, and a handgun. "If they're watching," he said grimly, "they're getting bolder." Seraphine pulled Ethan aside that afternoon. "You have to understand what's happening now," she said. "You're not just a kid with a bond to a broken dog. You're the last thread of something they thought was gone." Ethan looked at her, fear and anger mixing in his chest. "But why now? Why not years ago?" Seraphine's eyes narrowed. "Because they didn't know Havoc survived. Until he appeared in that shelter." The unspoken truth hung between them. Havoc had become the evidence they never intended to resurface. That night, Ethan opened his father's journal again. He found a page he'd overlooked, tucked between 2 entries. It was a rough sketch, coordinates, a map, and a series of dates and symbols he couldn't decode. Beneath it, his father had written, "If they come for you, go here. It's the only place they won't look." Ethan traced the spot on the map. It was deep in the Ashbourne forest, miles from town, near the ruins of a long-abandoned military outpost. Ethan knew what he had to do. Whatever waited in that forest was part of his father's plan, and Havoc's past. But they couldn't wait for danger to come to them. Not anymore. As he stared into the trees that night, Havoc sitting alert at his side, Ethan whispered, "We leave at dawn." Dawn broke with a pale, silver light as Ethan rolled down the ramp from the back porch, Havoc faithfully at his side. Karen tried to stop him, her voice strained, her hands trembling. "You're just a boy, Ethan. You can't." But Ethan met her eyes, calm but firm. "I'm not going to run anymore. He left that map for me. He wanted me to see this." Seraphine stepped in before the tension could rise. "I'll go with him. We all will." Within an hour, the van was packed. Maps, water, medical kits, and quiet determination. The road to Ashbourne was rough, winding through thick forest and forgotten trails. By midday, the van could go no further. They would have to walk the last mile. Tom carried most of the gear, his limp slowing him, but his resolve unshaken. Emily stayed near Ethan, who now pushed himself across uneven ground with surprising strength. Havoc walked ahead, his steps deliberate, as if he remembered every bend in the path. This was not new terrain for him, it was memory. They reached the edge of a ravine, where rusted fencing half buried in moss marked the perimeter of the old outpost. It had once been part of a covert training facility, now left to rot under decades of secrecy. Concrete bunkers slumped into the earth like broken teeth, and the air carried the faint scent of oil and decay. Ethan looked around and whispered, "This is where it ended for him." Havoc stopped at one of the buildings and scratched at the door. Ethan followed. Inside, the walls were covered in peeling paint and torn maps. A small desk in the corner held a metal box identical to the one they'd found in the storage unit. Inside it was another journal, older, more weathered. It belonged to another man, Valkyrie's original handler, whose name had been erased from most of the files Emily recovered. Tom opened the first page and his face went pale. "I know this handwriting," he said. "This was Sable Gravenheart. She vanished after the mission collapse." The entries inside were terrifying in their precision. Sable had documented experiments, not just on the dogs, but on their handlers. Emotional syncing, trauma bonding, even neural exposure. Valkyrie, Havoc, had responded beyond their expectations. "We created a mirror," she wrote. "He doesn't follow commands. He feels them. And now, he carries what we couldn't." A sudden sound outside cut through the heavy silence. Footsteps, deliberate and close. Havoc stood immediately, tail low, growl deep. Ethan didn't move, only gripped the wheels of his chair tighter. "We're not alone," Tom said, already reaching for his sidearm. Ethan looked down at Havoc and whispered, "You knew they'd come." The footsteps outside grew louder, steady, unhurried. Whoever they were, they didn't care about being heard. Tom raised his weapon and moved toward the door, motioning for the others to stay low. Havoc positioned himself in front of Ethan's wheelchair, his entire body tense, eyes locked on the entrance. The silence inside the bunker thickened as the door creaked open and a tall woman stepped through, dressed in black tactical gear, her expression unreadable. "I wondered if you'd find it," she said, eyes scanning the group. "You're Flintro's boy." Her voice was cold, almost clinical. "My name is Ravenna Hollowridge. I worked with your father, before he went rogue." She looked down at Havoc. "And you, Valkyrie, you should have stayed buried." The dog didn't growl, he simply stared, unmoving, unreadable. Ethan felt something strange pass through him, like a vibration in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was knowing. Ravenna stepped further into the bunker, gun holstered but visible. "What you've uncovered here, the journals, the files, they were never meant to resurface. Your father tried to expose the program, but he underestimated how far we'd go to keep it silent." She paused, gaze hardening. "You're a loose end now. All of you." Emily moved slightly in front of Ethan, her voice shaking. He was trying to protect his son. Protect Valkyrie. Ravenna's expression didn't change. "No. He was trying to rewrite what we did." Seraphine spoke next, stepping beside Tom. "You trained animals to carry trauma. You turned empathy into a weapon." Ravenna scoffed. "We turned it into a tool. And when the tool became unstable, we did what was necessary." Her eyes locked on Ethan. "But Valkyrie never let go of you, did he? That's why he came back. You're the imprint. You're the key." Ethan felt Havoc press against his leg. A memory surfaced, not his own. The desert wind, gunfire, a voice shouting, "Stay with him, Valkyrie." No matter what. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. It had always been about this moment. His father hadn't left behind just clues. He'd left a protector, one who remembered everything. I'm not giving him up, Ethan said, voice steady. You'll have to go through me. Ravenna raised her hand, but Havoc moved first. A blur of motion, teeth bared, weight crashing into her chest. The gun clattered to the floor. Tom rushed forward, pinning her down, adrenaline in his veins. The danger was over, for now. But as Ravenna looked up from the ground, blood at the corner of her mouth, she smiled. You think this ends with me? She whispered. You have no idea what you've just awakened. The sun was rising when they left the ruins behind. The forest around Ashbourne no longer felt like a maze of shadows, but like something ancient finally exhaling. Tom drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Seraphine sat beside him, keeping watch on the road behind. In the back seat, Ethan held the weathered journal tight to his chest, Havoc's head resting gently on his lap. Ravenna Hollowridge had been taken into custody, but her final words echoed louder than gunfire. At home, Karen waited on the porch. When she saw them approach, her eyes filled with relief and fear. Is it over? She asked. Ethan paused before answering. Not yet, but it started to heal. That night, for the first time since the accident, Ethan slept without waking in terror. His dreams were quiet, peaceful. He didn't see fire or wreckage. He saw a man kneeling beside a golden dog, whispering something that only they understood. Over the next weeks, Seraphine and Emily helped sort the documents recovered from the bunker. Together, they built a case file that exposed the full extent of Project Valkyrie. Experiments in emotional imprinting, manipulation through empathy, and the silencing of handlers who broke the rules. Tom offered his name and testimony to the authorities, even knowing the risks. We owe it to them, he said, to every soldier, and every animal they used like a machine. But the real change came in Ethan. At school, he began to speak again. Not because he was forced, but because he chose to. He shared his story, piece by piece. Not the classified parts, not the names or missions, but the feeling of being seen, of being protected, of having something worth holding on to. Havoc followed him everywhere, now officially registered as a service dog, though everyone knew it was something more than that. One morning, while walking Havoc past the edge of Hollowridge Park, Ethan found a plaque near the Old War Memorial. It had been added quietly, anonymously. It read, "To those who remember what others choose to forget, for loyalty without condition, and courage beyond words." No names, no ranks, but Ethan understood. And Havoc simply sat beside it and closed his eyes. In the months that followed, rumors spread of other dogs like Havoc, scattered across the country, reappearing in shelters, drawn to people carrying deep pain. Emily began to investigate. Seraphine received encrypted messages with no sender. Something was stirring again. But for Ethan, one truth remained. He wasn't broken. And Havoc wasn't just a rescued dog. They were survivors. They were proof. And the silence between them would never return.